Good afternoon, everyone. Initially, when I was going to give this talk, I thought I'd talk to you a bit more about what I do, which is renewable energy. But as life would have it, there were a certain series of events going on in my own personal life that completely changed the course of this discussion today. At the time, we were busy with a project which we were promoting in the media. And at first, I was very excited about this opportunity to talk about a very technical field in a non-technical platform. However, I soon realized that the media wasn't really interested in hearing about renewables or the technicalities of that. They were more interested in my backstory. So the question I kept being asked was, what are the key challenges you face as a Black African woman in a white-dominated corporate space? Initially, I answered this question in a very dismissive manner because I didn't really know what to say. Then the question kept coming up over and over again. And I recall talking to a friend of mine and voicing my frustration. I actually wanted to show off what I know about renewables and not talk about the backstory. She asked me to interrogate what the real issue was behind my discomfort with that question. And when I sat down and thought about it, I felt that the question put me in a position of disadvantage or weakness. It assumed that I was weak or disadvantaged because of my race and gender. Furthermore, I hadn't really unpacked for myself personally what it was to be Black, African, and female in my setting. So I started to think about it seriously. In the start of my career, I never really used to see a difference between men and women because when I looked around in my law school, the top students were always female. But that changed when I started work. I remember the first internship I did at a top-tier law firm. A large number of the partners were men, white men, and very few were women. None were Black women. I remember one afternoon on a Friday, this junior female partner went up to a senior male partner, and she was asking if she could leave work early that day. By early, she meant 5 o'clock. And the reason she wanted to leave early was that she wanted to plan her son's first birthday, which was taking place the next day, so she wanted to run some errands. Without even looking at her, the male partner just muttered under his breath, "Women with children are a liability." In that moment, as a young, impressionable attorney, I recognized that I'd have to make a choice between my professional life and my personal life. Here was a clear example that the two could not coexist, and I wanted to succeed in this environment. I then went on to work for other law firms and other female partners. The thing I observed was that the female partners almost always fell into two distinct categories. On one hand, you had the female partners that were the rainmakers. The rainmakers were the high fee earners. They worked the longest hours. They had the best or top tier clients, and they enjoyed respect in the firm. On the other side of the spectrum, you had the female partners that had slowed down a bit in order to balance life and career. One thing I observed between both groups of women is that they seemed to pass judgment on each other and each other's choices. So the female rainmaker partners used to see the working mothers as a burden to the firm, people who weren't earning their keep because they were not billing as much as they were. The working mothers, or the working married female partners, saw the rainmakers as women who had essentially failed at being women, because most times these women were not married, or they were divorced, or they were just dating. What both groups of women failed to see was that these categories were designed to put them against each other. What they failed to see was that the fundamental flaw was not the choices they had made in their professional and personal lives, but rather the fact that they were operating in an environment designed by men for men. The male partners never had to choose between being successful at home and at work. In fact, they were successful at both. It's only the women that always found themselves consistently making these choices. And in the process of judging each other, these women failed to recognize that neither of them had any real power in the firm. So on one hand, the female rainmaker would make it to the board of executives. The board of executives takes the key decisions in the firm. However, should always be in the minority and would always be outvoted. On the other side, the women partners that had cut back on their hours had essentially removed themselves from the race. Whenever I read statistics or books or articles on why there are so few women in leadership positions in corporate South Africa or in the world generally, often they focus on the external factors. They focus on the men or the culture or the systems that exclude women. I recently asked myself whether we had to start looking internally. Could we potentially be contributing to the status quo? As women, we've internalized this idea that there can only be one seat at the boardroom table, and we have to fight each other to get it, instead of creating more seats, that way changing the dynamics in the boardroom. We've, for the most part, failed to form alliances within the workplace, and we've looked at each other's decisions with judgment and failed to see strength in our differences. We have, in many respects, become our own worst critics. Up until this point, I've talked to you about what I've observed as a woman in corporate. However, being a Black African woman in corporate South Africa has its own burden. On one hand, you are dealing with issues of race, and then you're dealing with issues of gender, not only gender issues in the work context, but in your culture and tradition. I often say that as a Black African woman in the workplace, you're often straddling two fine lines between leading from the front, which is what we're taught to do in the workplace, and leading from behind, which is what some African cultures teach us to do. For the longest time, our voices as African women haven't been part of the feminist discourse. And the general view is that we hold a unified single view on gender matters and on women empowerment. The general perception is that African culture cannot exist hand in hand with the economic empowerment of women. So as young lawyers, again, what we observed was that the female partners that were African often adopted a Western demeanor. We were taught that in the workplace, really, there wasn't a place for any culture or tradition or for us to hold that part of ourselves out there. For a long time, I personally also bought into this until I met a woman who changed my perceptions. She was a very successful female attorney. She actually went on to be an executive at one of the world's top energy companies. She wore her hair in dreadlocks. Sometimes she'd wear African dresses to work, or suits. Ironically, she happened to be married to a traditional African chief. They had 2 children who were very educated, well-traveled, and yet still respected their cultures and traditions. When asked how she had managed to balance being both a successful attorney and businesswoman and a wife, she said one thing. She said, "At every place I go to, I show up as myself. I've taken those parts of my tradition which have worked for me and have excluded those that have not. I've also taken the best part of me as an African woman into the workplace. At every juncture in my life, she said, I've had to negotiate my position, whether it's at home with my husband or at work. That statement liberated me because she spoke to the possibility that we could be ourselves and that there was room for us to be ourselves at work and at home. The common thread that I've noticed in my experiences, both as a woman and as an African woman in the workplace, is that our biggest challenge is not just external, but it's internal within us. We felt the need to compete in environments not designed for us. We've seen each other as competitors. We've bought into this idea that there can only be one powerful woman. We've also accepted as African women the limited narrative that in order to succeed, you need to be westernized. So I'd like to end off with a quote by Wangari Maathai, where she stated, African women in general need to know that it is okay for them to be the way they are, to see the way they are as strength, and to be liberated from fear and silence. Thank you.